I am MRX Centre. Here is my keynote. So if you've read the abstract, you'll see that I proposed for this particular talk to develop a framework for the investigation of conspiracy theories, a task I have somewhat failed to do. And this talk is actually going to be a discussion as to why, before we can get to a discussion of how to investigate conspiracy theories, we need to do some preliminary work to understand how things such as investigations work, how evidence works, and exactly what has been going on in the philosophical debate up to this point, which might allow us to develop a framework for investigation, but also might suggest that there is no singular framework we could appeal to anyway. So really, this talk shouldn't be called Investigating Conspiracy Theories, because I'm not going to be investigating any conspiracy theories in this talk, although I will be investigating conspiracy theory. I did toy with another title, but unfortunately, Keith Harris has already published a paper called Some Problems with Particularism, and thus it actually ends up not being a very useful title for me to use. So instead, the title really should be a sketch of how we might investigate conspiracy theories, or some prelims for the investigation of conspiracy theories. Now, this talk actually has a very distant origin, and I have to make a small apology to Charles Pigton, because Charles is kind of responsible for why this talk exists. Many years ago, Charles, in personal conversation, suggested that someone, and I think he was prodding at me at the time, should develop a model or framework for the investigation of conspiracy theories. His argument basically was, look, we've kind of developed a sketch in philosophy that shows that we can't just dismiss conspiracy theories as a class, so we should reject generalism, that we should assess conspiracy theories on their evidential merits. But how we assess conspiracy theories on the evidential merits is still an open question. And when I was searching for photos of Charles online to put in the beginning, I couldn't help but use this one that was published in the Otago Daily Times after Charles published Complots of Mischief. I think it's a marvelous photo, and so Charles, hopefully you don't mind my using it today. So Charles's challenge was, look, we've shown that we can say there's nothing inherently wrong with conspiracy theories, which of course doesn't tell us that we should believe all conspiracy theories, but it does suggest that we should have some kind of mechanism or framework or set of guidelines for assessing which conspiracy theories are good and which conspiracy theories are bad. And so we should be able to develop a framework for the investigation of conspiracy theories to give advice to people like journalists, Secret Service agents, members of the intelligence apparatus, historians, and the like, when they are looking into some claim of conspiracy. And so this suggests, to my mind, that there are basically two projects in this thing called particularism. Now, particularism by this point in time in the academic literature probably doesn't need much of an introduction. But for those of you who are new to conspiracy theory and philosophy, or our friends from outside philosophy who may not know what this debate is all about, in a paper in 2010, Jill Bunting and Jason Taylor introduced a distinction, very briefly at the beginning of their paper, between generalism, defined as, according to the generalist view, the rationality of conspiracy theories can be assessed without considering particular conspiracy theories. On this view, conspiratorial thinking, qua conspiracy thinking, is itself irrational. So they say this is what the generalist does. Versus the particularist, who says the particularist view about conspiratorial thinking denies that the rationality of conspiracy theories can be assessed without considering particular conspiracy theories. Now, as I say, in this paper, they're actually more interested in a different debate, which is a debate about evidence and the notion that there is some evidence which seems on the face of it so lucky to support one particular view that it really should suggest that we should think about it again, because it might suggest the existence of a conspiracy. So Bunting and Taylor want to talk about what they call fortuitous data which actually suggests that the evidence for a view is so lucky that it actually suggests that maybe there might be a cover-up. But to get to that distinction, they need to talk about a distinction between two different ways of looking at these things called conspiracy theories that they analyze was already present in the literature. And so particularists like myself picked up upon this distinction and have been running with it ever since, arguing that, look, there really is a divide between academic work going on in the field of conspiracy theory, the analysis of these things called conspiracy theories, where some people think we do have a prima facie case for saying that there's something wrong with conspiracy theories, and particularists who are going, I mean, there are problems with some conspiracy theories, but we cannot generalize to the class of conspiracy theories based upon the problems with some of those beliefs. And of course, some is one of those tricky words, because some sometimes implies all, and sometimes only implies very little. And so there's an open debate as to whether some conspiracy theories are bad, actually indicates that it's only a few, whether it's a great many, or whether it's possibly even most conspiracy theories. And particularists will go, well, look, we can even accept that most conspiracy theories might turn out to be mad, bad, or dangerous, but we still actually need to check to see whether the particular conspiracy theory we're being presented with at this time is something which we ought not to believe, or we ought to believe given the evidence. And so that suggests, as I say, a second project. Because the first project in particularism, which I am calling Treating Conspiracy Theory Seriously, is the standard particularist line. You can't just dismiss a claim because it's been labeled a conspiracy theory. You need to actually spend some time actually thinking about the theory and analyzing whether it is actually an example of a bad or unwarranted conspiracy theory. And that gives us a project that says, look, you can't just work with a general dismissal of these things called conspiracy theories. You must assess them with respect to something, say, like the evidence. But there's a second project that particularists could engage in. And that is, how might we go about assessing or showing that a particular conspiracy theory is something that we should believe, or in some cases, should not believe? I.e., particularists could engage in a project where they actually give people guidelines for the assessment of conspiracy theories. And this seems to be what Charles's challenge is about. It's about how do we give people the guidance to be able to analyze and investigate conspiracy theories in order to work out whether we ought to believe them or ought not to believe them. Now, I'm going to argue that the second project is something that would be nice to have, but it's actually not essential for the philosopher to engage in that process. And there are a variety of different reasons as to why you might think it's nice to have, but not necessarily something that philosophers have to do. And part of that comes out of the philosophy of science and the sociology of science. There's been a long discussion in the philosophy of science as to what the scientific method is, how the scientific method works, and whether the philosophical ideal of what the scientific method is and how it works even vaguely reflects how scientists go about doing science. And one thing, and my partner is a molecular biologist, so I have some anecdotal but personal experience here. One thing scientists don't seem to like is when philosophers tell them that they're doing science wrong. So there is this particular problem here where we might come up with a kind of ideal of this is how these investigations should work. And then the people that we actually want to do those investigations, because I'm assuming that by and large, philosophers aren't going to go out into the world and start analyzing particular conspiracy theories to investigate them. I mean, we might want to, but we might not be in the best place to do it. We might come up with an ideal framework or model, and then when we tell investigative journalists how to do their jobs, they might tell us to insert rude word on. So there could be a whole bunch of issues with respect to we can generate the model, but we're not necessarily the people to be able to give people the moral guidance for these particular types of investigations. Philosophers like to deal sometimes with ideals, and journalists, historians, social scientists, and the like to deal with what people actually are coping with in the world, rather than our philosophical ideals. So there might be a reason there to go, well, look, we could generate an investigative framework, but actually might not be very useful if we then have to tell people this is how you should go about investigating conspiracy theories. Which is why I think Project 2 is a nice to have, but it's not necessarily essential, and there might even be reasons to think maybe we shouldn't do it. Maybe we're much better being critics and conscience of society rather than putting forward actual edicts as to how people should work. I'm also now thinking of the Philosopher Kings and the great mistake that Aristotle made with respect to Macedonia. History does not forget. Now, to engage in this discussion as to how we might get to an investigative framework, because I still think we can talk about guidelines and the way that we talk about things, I want to kind of reorientate the discussion away from warrant, as it has been in most of the literature, and reorientate it towards suspicious conspiracy theories. So most of the academic literature in philosophy, when it comes to the debate about particularism, is talking about whether we have warranted or unwarranted conspiracy theories, what makes a theory warranted, what makes a theory unwarranted. I want to kind of sidestep that as kind of a sop to the generalist. I want to say, well, look, obviously, when we're concerned about investigating conspiracy theories, we are concerned about investigating suspicious conspiracy theories. So we are interested in a particular class of theory which has a set of features that make people think that these theories are suspicious in some kind. And this has been discussed to a large extent in the existing particularist literature. Brian, for example, talks about the notion of the mature conspiracy theory, a conspiracy theory which, despite the fact it doesn't seem to have adequate evidence presented in favor of it, continues to persist in general or public discussion. And so it seems mature. It seems to be the kind of thing which, and this is a strange analogy for me to make because I'm vegan, it seems to be like a particular type of cheese. It has a smell. Some smelly cheeses, I'm told, are delicious, nutritious, and healthy to eat. And some smelly cheeses are things that as soon as they start to smell, you should throw away. So the fact you find a cheese which has a particular stench means you might go, maybe I shouldn't put that on my toast for breakfast this morning. But it depends on the kind of cheese. It actually, if it's, I was recently in Parma, so if it's Parmigiano Reggiano, if it's a 36-month-year-old version of that cheese, as my friend Timothy says, it's very, very, very piquant. And thus, it is very delicious. But there are certain cheeses you might find at the back of your fridge, which have been there for a long time, have lost their label, have developed a bit of a smell, and probably should be thrown out. So maturity is like a stinky cheese. You can't just tell from the look of it, you do need to actually check. Charles Pigden has talked about the notion that there are certain conspiracies implied by conspiracy theories, which have a kind of feature of defectability. You'd expect someone to have defected from the conspiracy if the cost of defection is low and the benefit of defecting is high. I've talked about the notion that there are certain conspiracy theories which resemble recurrent narratives, and those narratives have been shown to be bad in the past, and that gives us limited grounds to go, well, if this new theory resembles an older theory which we already know has been investigated and looked bad, that gives us some limited grounds to go, it's probably bad as well. And Juha Räikä and Lee Basham have talked about how there are certain conspiracy theories which have fantastical elements within them, such that they just aren't the kind of things we reasonably would expect to exist in the world in which we live now. So, for example, David Icke and his alien shape-shifting reptiles. Most of us, I'm going to assume, although maybe it's not a safe assumption, a very conference on conspiracy theory, do not believe in pan-dimensional alien shape-shifting reptiles from another dimension who function as an archontic virus who persists through history, having seeded religion with the symbols of their demonology as broadcast from the planet Satan, also known as Saturn, broadcast through the moon to imprison us in a holographic prison planet. I'm assuming virtually no one in this room believes that thesis to be true, because we think it's so fantastical that actually it kind of challenges our preconceptions of the world, and thus it turns out it's probably something which isn't very likely. Now, as I argue in my paper, Suspicious Conspiracy Theories, this doesn't tell us these theories are necessarily false. With respect to maturity, yes, some smelly cheeses are bad. Some smelly cheeses, though, are delicious. And it might be the case that someone has very successfully covered up their conspiracy for a long period of time, and then eventually some evidence drop occurs, or someone dies and leaves behind a will or a set of letters, and a previously mature conspiracy theory we thought was unwarranted actually turns out to be something where we've suddenly got evidence to say it actually is true. As Charles has admitted, a major problem with talking about defectability, the notion that certain conspiracies you would expect people to defect from, is that, of course, wise conspirators, is wise the right word there? It's just gentle whether you think conspiring can be a good pursuit. Clever conspirators, that's a better term. Clever conspirators will be aware that some people may want to eventually defect from their conspiracy and may set up mechanisms to ensure that the cost of defection is always going to be high. And Guy pointed out, the thing about recurrent narratives is that based upon the inductive principle, yes, in the past these theories have been bad, but there's nothing stopping a theory with those recurrent features being true today. The example I use in Suspicious Conspiracy Theories is there's been a long-standing claim by right-wing conspiracy theorists that climate change is a hoax being orchestrated by climate scientists to make us think the world is about to end in order to get large amounts of grant money. So one version of the conspiracy theory there is that climate scientists are faking the data for some purpose. I think it's not plausible, but I think it's possible that, say, tomorrow, a group of climate scientists get together and go, look, world governments are doing nothing about climate change. We keep giving them the data that everything is going to hell in a handbasket very quickly. They won't act upon it. So tomorrow, we are going to start exaggerating all of the data in order to try and get the people to pressure their governments to finally do something. There is nothing stopping the climate scientists tomorrow engaging in a conspiracy if they feel it's the way to achieve their goal of actually stopping runaway climate change. So the fact that these theories have been bad in the past only gives us a weak or limited suspicion that they're going to be bad in the future. And of course, the thing about fantastical elements is that fantasy is context relevant. What we take to be fantastical today is not necessarily taken to be fantastical in other points in time. One thing to note about the Western world is that certain parts of the world are more or less religious. So New Zealand is largely a secular society, and we do, by and large, think of theists as being ever so slightly weird, because they believe in this fantasy figure in the heavens with a causative power upon the earth. So within a New Zealand context, religious belief is something which you're allowed to have, but people will be very suspicious of you if you're very public about it. But of course, if you go to the United States of America, being an atheist is considered to be rather weird, because it's quite normal to believe in what the New Zealander thinks is the fantastical, and the American takes to be normal. Which is to say, we might think that David Icke is wrong to say there are alien shape-shifting reptiles from another dimension, insert rest of that long description there. Someone should probably check, because if it turns out we are actually being controlled by blood-drinking members of the royal family of the United Kingdom, we probably do want to put a stop to it. So there are these conspiracy theories which have suspicious features, and these suspicious features give us a limited suspicion of conspiratorial claims. The particularist goes, well, look, you still need to assess them. You need to engage in some kind of investigation to work out whether the suspicious feature licenses some other claim within the world. So particularists have already done some of the groundwork for saying, look, this is how we might approach an investigation of conspiracy theories without actually doing the And this is how you actually check for suspiciousness to say whether it's weak and limited or strong, such that we think we've got a case to saying the theory is actually really mad, bad, and dangerous. When I was making these slides, I realized I was going to start talking about weasel words. I don't know whether you have this cliche about weasels in this part of the world like we do in New Zealand, which is actually kind of weird because we don't have many weasels in New Zealand at all. But for some reason, the stereotype we have about weasels is they're wily, tricky characters who are prone to tricking people all the time. And so when people use arguments which trade on ambiguity, people say they're using weasel words. They're trying to weasel their way through an argument. And I want to highlight that I have been and will be using weasel words throughout this presentation. Because these weasel words are quite salient towards an investigative framework, but at the same time really are in need of good definitions. Because we can talk about adequate evidence. What is the good evidence for a particular claim, or what adequate evidence do we have to not believe a particular claim? And we can talk about thoroughly investigate, and we might all go, oh yes, I know what you mean by thoroughly investigate. But of course, sometimes when we're talking about adequate evidence and thoroughly investigating things, our meanings actually change quite considerably from person to person, or from discipline to discipline. So what do I mean by adequate evidence? Well, I think if we're going to be investigating conspiracy theories, we need something more than the kind of evidential burden that exists within our legal system. Now, the reason why I'm talking about the legal system here is that one species of conspiratorial claim that often doesn't get discussed in the academic literature is corporate or legal conspiracies. These are pursued through the courts all the time, from gang deals around drugs to corporate malfeasance where people are using and abusing corporate funds to achieve particular malicious ends. Corporate conspiracies, legal conspiracies, and civil conspiracies are a known factor in our society. They are investigated routinely, and you'd be surprised if you actually went through court records how many of them are proven on a week-by-week basis. And obviously, these get shown through the courts using the legal burden of proof. But of course, we're all aware that when we're talking about the law, we're talking about crimes or civil charges which are in contravention of particular legal statutes. So we're proving that a law has been broken. We're not necessarily going as far as we would do in a kind of epistemic evaluation as to exactly whether the evidence really does show something. Rather, we have a preponderance to think, given what we know, it is likely this is the case, and a legal sanction is going to be meted down. And it's in part because different parts of the judicial system work in different ways, and also different countries use different judicial systems in the first place. For a New Zealander, looking at the way the French legal system works for criminal prosecutions is quite eye-opening, with the notion of police prosecutors working with the police, as opposed to our separation of powers back home, where prosecutors do not work with the police. They only work when the police have sufficient charges to bear, then the legal system comes in. So we talk about adequate evidence when we're doing investigations. We want something which goes slightly beyond the legal case, more into the case of a robust epistemological framework that tells us that evidence works in particular ways. And that kind of gets us to the whole notion of thoroughly investigate, because it might be very hard to thoroughly investigate quite a lot of things called conspiracy theories. In part because not everything which is called a conspiracy theory turns out to be a conspiracy theory. A few years ago, I remember hearing about this in the distant year of our Lord, 2021, when I was stuck on the campus of Beijing Normal University at Zhuhai during a holiday, and I learned about the birds aren't real TikTok phenomena, which was being treated seriously by a lot of scholars for how do people believe the CIA eradicated all the birds in the 1950s and 60s and replaced them with drones. It's the most ridiculous conspiracy theory we've ever heard. And then social scientists who are looking into these things go, you do realize no one actually believes this theory. It's an elaborate game which is played by people on social media, where they put forward a ridiculous proposition, and then they then go out of their way to go, look, how could I try to prove a ridiculous proposition to a friend? And they do it either by collecting ancillary evidence or making up new evidence claims. It turns out no one believes the conspiracy theory that birds aren't real. It is just a game being played online. And it was inadvertently or mistakenly called a conspiracy theory by some researchers, even though it turns out there's no belief in a conspiracy there. It is just an elaborate game. Now, admittedly, we have to be cautious about this because some elaborate games actually do become conspiracy theories. We have very good grounds to believe that the phenomenon known as QAnon started as a game on 8chan. I have to remember which of the chans these things actually are. Both 4 and 8chan. And now 8kun. And now I can't actually remember what Ron Watkins' new platform is called. On 8chan and 4chan, there was a game that was being played on a lot of threads where people would pretend to be an operative in a secret service somewhere around the world, and they would start making up elaborate stories whilst the other members of the thread engaged in role play around these stories. At some point, the QAnon role-playing event, the threads were suddenly swamped by people who weren't aware what the rules of the game were. And so QAnon transitioned from a game that was being played by participants who knew it was a game to a game being played by one person, with most of the other participants in the thread not realizing they're playing a game. And then, and this is where things get tricky, then presumably at some point, the original Q then changed character, so it was being written by someone else, and then was being used likely by Ron Watkins as a way of generating, or as we say in the trade, grifting around a conspiracy theory. So we had a game like Birds Aren't Real, which then transitioned into a conspiracy theory, which is, I would say, well believed. Actually, statistically, QAnon beliefs in the US are actually not significantly high. They're worryingly high if we're concerned about these kind of beliefs, but they're not. If it's not a majoritarian belief. It's probably believed. Well, actually, so quoting Joe Usinski, about 12% of the American population know about QAnon. It's probably actually a much smaller proportion that actually believe in the QAnon hypothesis. So one of the problems we have in the social science literature, particularly in social psychology, is that sometimes when we're polling on conspiracy beliefs, we are polling whether people have heard of a theory rather than whether they believe the particular theory. Now, arguably, it doesn't actually matter how many people believe in a theory. What probably matters is whether people act on that theoretical belief. So even if it turns out not many people believe in QAnon, if it's sufficient to say organize insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th or be part of that movement, you might go, well, that's concerning whether or not many people believe it. For some people who do believe it can be worrying. And of course, from a New Zealand perspective, we had an individual that New Zealanders by and large only refer to as the Christchurch terrorist, since we don't really want his name going down in history, believing that there was a great replacement going on in our homeland, getting rid of the white people who for some reason quite naturally belong in a Polynesian country, and then shot 49 Muslims dead in 2 mosques back in Christchurch. So even though only one person believes a theory, very bad things can actually emerge from it. So even though some of these games might look ridiculous on the face of it, consequences can come out of it if people believe them. Another reason why we might think that there is a problem with the thoroughly investigating claims is that some conspiracy theories cannot be investigated, or at least they cannot be thoroughly investigated. There are historical mysteries that we do not have enough evidence about to be able to ascertain the truth of those claims. A nice historical example of this is historians to this day are still debating why Julius Caesar was killed by a cohort of conspirators. Because the official story, as presented by the conspirators themselves, was that they were ridding Rome of a dictator. The rival hypothesis is that we actually have some of the letters that Marcus Brutus sent to his supporters after he had to flee Rome, after Marcus Antonius made his grand speech about how Caesar was beloved of the people, and that the conspirators were in fact evil doers. Itself a conspiracy because Mark Antony had previously told the conspirators that he would valorize them in the speech and then he'd condemn them. The letters that Marcus Brutus sent back to the supporters would go, look, I don't understand. Why didn't the Roman people elect me dictator? Now they've rid them of the wrong dictator. Marcus Brutus was of the right family of the founding of Rome. Julius Caesar was of a lesser noble class. Marcus Brutus felt if there's going to be a dictator, it might as well be me. And so historians are debating, did the other conspirators know that this was Marcus Brutus's plan? Or did Marcus Brutus have a conspiracy within the conspiracy to persuade other senators to assassinate Caesar and then supplant that conspiracy with a new conspiracy, making himself the dictator of Rome? Of course, it didn't really work out because Augustus Caesar took charge instead, and we all know what happened after that. So there are some historical mysteries that we can't even investigate because we do not have access to the data anymore. And that actually raises a really interesting conundrum, because that means that there were some conspiracy theories which were, in principle, able to be thoroughly investigated at time t, and now at time t plus 1 or plus 2 or plus x have turned out to be things that cannot be investigated properly at all. We know there was an imperial archive of all of the correspondence of Caesar, of Augustus, of Tiberius, Claudius, of Nero and the like, and that royal archive is gone. We no longer have access to that correspondence. All we've got access is the reports of that correspondence by historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, who had access to the archives for limited amounts of time, wrote things down, and that's all we've got left. There are some claims that we just cannot investigate because they're just beyond our ability to engage in a thorough investigation anymore. So there are kind of limitations for the investigation with respect to how much access we have. There may never be adequate evidence to allow us to thoroughly investigate some particular claims. Now, I'll go back to that previous slide. So there's another issue we need to think about here, and this is something which I brought up in the past, which is it's also what I call the economic argument around investigation. Most of us do not have the time or the energy to investigate every conspiracy theory we encounter. Now, I'm assuming most of us in this room, because we are interested in conspiracy theories, probably know an uncommon number of conspiracy theories. And so if we were to investigate the conspiracy theories we know, then we'd probably never have breakfast. You'd get up, start your investigation, it would become midnight, you go back to bed, you'd starve to death within a few days. We just don't have the time or energy to do it. And I would argue it's even more of an arduous task to demand that members of the general public engage in this particular kind of thing. Most of us do not just have the time or energy. Members of the general public who have 2.5 children, 2 pets, a partner, and a 9-to-5 job do not have time to then spend even an hour a day engaging in the investigation of conspiracy theories. There are so many of them. And this is to be expected. There are many scientific theories out there, and scientists have to pick and choose which theories they're going to investigate and which theories they're going to treat seriously. Historians have a similar issue. If they're interested in a particular period of time, there will be lots of historical theses about that time, which they're curious about, and then they have to pick and choose which ones they're going to select, often with what we say back home, FOMO, fear of missing out. That actually, I really was interested in why they built roads from place X to place Y, but really I actually wanted to look at how the crockery was arranged on a royal tables during the same period. That would have been equally fascinating. Within every domain, there are multiple theories that we have to then focus on the ones that we think of as important. Now, I've argued one way to kind of sidestep this would be to have communities of inquiry of a Deweyan nature. We're not going to say much about that because I believe Melina is going to actually have some not so curt but gentle criticism of that in her presentation later on today. So I've suggested that we could have Deweyan communities of inquiry to engage in these investigations. I may well be slightly optimistic and naive, but I do come from the southern hemisphere where we have a high trust in government, and thus these communities in our system, I would say, would work, but arguably that may not be the case. More on that later on today. Okay, so we've got some caveats here. So some conspiracy theories just don't turn out to be conspiracy theories. Some conspiracy theories actually may just exist merely as a signaling device. So one particular issue we have is that sometimes a conspiracy theory is a post facto justification for something that people were inclined to do for ideological reasons in the first place. One of the big discussions going on in sociology at the moment is, do Trumpers actually believe things like the big lie election stealing hypothesis? Some of the sociology suggests that yes, some of them do, but some of them are only expressing that particular conspiracy theory because that is part of being in the political movement. You have to at least ostensibly appear to believe this particular claim. Even if it turns out by using a whole bunch of interesting survey questions, you can elicit that they have high trust in elections. They just have to express they don't trust this one because their leader has expressed doubt about that one. And as we've seen, some conspiracy theories cannot be thoroughly investigated. Okay, so I'm going to make two more points and then we're going to open things up to questions. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. I've already signaled that I've already used some vague and ambiguous terminology you should be pinging me on, as we say back home. You should be gently criticizing or not so gently criticizing me for doing. But the final 2 points I want to make, the first is, if we're going to be serious about investigating conspiracy theories, we actually need to make sure we're investigating what conspiracy theorists say and believe. A recurrent feature in the academic literature, particularly in social psychology, is that conspiracy theories are described in abstract terms with umbrella labels. We're talking about QAnon theories or JFK conspiracy theories. We're talking about flat earth theories, without the realization that there are multitude versions of those theories within those clusters. And I just want to very quickly illustrate that when we talk about JFK conspiracy theories, there are implausible JFK conspiracy theories and JFK conspiracy theories which people do find to be plausible for good reason. And I want to give you two examples of plausible JFK conspiracy theories. I'll say I believe they're true, but they were believed by people who took them seriously at the time. The first is Lyndon B. Johnson, President of the United States after JFK was assassinated, was of the firm belief that JFK was assassinated by a Cuban conspiracy. We know this because we have memos from the White House where Johnson actually outlines that this is his belief, and he's then persuaded by the Attorney General of the United States at the time that it would not be wise to express those views in public, and instead they should lay the blame on Lee Harvey Oswald, because the public needs to think it was a one-off event with no connection to any other political shenanigans going on. So Lyndon Johnson says, I think it was a conspiracy. but he decides that for the good of the American people, it is best that they believe that only one person was involved. That doesn't mean that Lyndon Johnson was correct in thinking that there was a conspiracy, but it was taken seriously by high echelons of the American government at the time. And then when there was a congressional investigation into the Warren Commission in the 1970s, I wish I'd written this date down, the congressional investigation into the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy said, look, the CIA and the FBI narrowed down on one subject, Lee Harvey Oswald, very early on in the investigation. They did not pursue other leads. They did not adequately investigate the death of the president. So we have a congressional investigation pinging the Warren Commission for being one-sided and one-eyed, and not actually considering relevant alternatives at the time. So we have people in the American establishment who are casting doubt on the official theory without necessarily us having to say that the official theory itself is false, just that there are plausible reasons to think that people know about these variant theories and go, well, look, if the President of the United States think that it wasn't just Lee Harvey Oswald, surely that does license being at least somewhat suspicious of the official theory as presented. So if we're going to talk about investigating conspiracy theories, we shouldn't be using these umbrella terms or cluster concepts. We should talk about the theories people actually believe if we want to assess them on their merits. And the last thing I want to say before we bring things to a close, and this is kind of what made me think that maybe developing a framework for the investigation of conspiracy theories is not going to be entirely successful, although I do think we can present guidelines for how these investigations can occur, is that I don't even think there's going to be a singular framework for the investigation of conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories come in a wide variety. Historical theories, sociological theories, political theories, criminal theories, civil theories, and they get investigated by a whole bunch of different people. Police inspectors, sociologists, historians. There are a bunch of different experts out there, or expert groups. Brian and I have written on the how do we actually appeal to expertise when it comes to assessing whether a conspiracy theory is good or bad, and they all function with different frameworks. They all have different ideas as to what a thorough investigation might look like, and crucially, they've all, in some stage, investigated conspiracy theories, and on the basis of their investigations, many people have said that conspiracy theory is unwarranted, and thus we should think that suspicious conspiracy theory is bad. And some of them have gone, well, actually, there's good grounds to think a conspiracy did occur. So you get investigations of criminal conspiracies as drug dealers in the police trade, or the 3-year investigation by Woodward and Bernstein into the break-in at the Dallas Hotel. So because there are multiple routes for the investigation of conspiracy theories, done by multiple experts in multiple domains, we probably need to be particularists about investigative processes. There probably is no one grand unified way to say that we can go around assessing conspiracy theories. Rather, we have to appeal to the fact that there are lots and lots of different ways to kind of come to the truth of these claims through pluralistic investigative efforts. Now, in closing, I want to say that one benefit of the work that has been done by particularists over the last 20 years is that we have done a lot of the place setting or table setting for the discussion as to what kinds of conspiracy theories we might have a limited suspicion of. We've talked about the kinds of evidence that can be used for or against claims of conspiracy. We've talked about the inferential practices which may justify particular conspiracy theories as being explanations which we should believe. And we've looked at the way that expertise is very, very hard to pass, both with respect to who the experts are and whether we should be appealing to those experts. So the table has been set for guidelines towards the investigation of conspiracy theory. But I do apologize to those of you who thought I was going to give you those guidelines or model today. It turns out that you can write an astounding abstract promising the world 6 months ago, and then spend 6 months writing a paper realizing that maybe it was never achievable in the first place. Thank you.